On the last episode of the Keepsake box, Antonio walked over to where I was seated on the couch. He sat beside me and interlocked his fingers with mine. Antonio looked directly into my eyes as he spoke. "You know I love you, right? You just have to learn that I'm not on your time." I didn't speak. He told me that I wasn't cut out for that life, and he was sorry to have brought me into it. Antonio apologized for the Peaches situation, as if he had simply stepped on our foot. He admitted that things had gone too far, and he wanted to know if we could start over. "Start over?" I asked. "How do we just start over after everything we've been through?" "Just bow out, little girl." That was his answer. Just bow out, as if that would fix everything. Just bow out, as if that would absolve me of the guilt related to Peaches' death and Sharon losing her salon. Apparently, the simple act of bowing out would change the past and allow us all to start over. For the first time, Antonio's solution didn't impress me. Antonio told me that he wanted me to let him be the man. He asked me to let him run the businesses and he would take care of me. "We can make this easy. We can just start over." I thought for a moment. As much as I wanted to keep up the facade, I knew he was right. I was tired, but more than being tired, I was scared. Truthfully, I knew I could resist. Legally, Antonio didn't have a leg to stand on. We hadn't made provisions for him to retrieve his businesses upon his return. But the goons, they ain't play by legal rules. By their standards, I knew that any day could be the day that I regretted being resistance. And I ain't want to end up in the bathtub. Antonio cupped my chin in his hands. "What are we going to do? We going to make this easy?" I told him that I'd give him everything that he asked for. Antonio looked into my eyes and addressed me. He said, "That's a good girl. And this Diablo thing, that's over, right?" I nodded my head, acknowledging that I would end my relationship with Angel. Antonio kissed me, and even though he had swindled me out of my business, I gave in. Even though I know he'd had Peaches killed, I gave in. And even though I always knew I was within 30 minutes of being next, I gave in. Chapter 22, All Good Things. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. They say that all good things come to an end. In our case, a stale and mediocre situation was about to come to an end. There are instances where endings are necessary. I can admit that my relationship with Antonio has started to get to that point. But the way our situation ended would haunt me for years to come. Actually, I think it may haunt me forever. It was 2005 and I was 25 years old. Antonio was 37. I spent the day getting prepared as Antonio and I were leaving for Hawaii the next day. I was surprised that Antonio had suggested the trip. It seemed that he and I were more like business partners than people in a relationship. We handled business and settled into a comfortable routine. But that's all it was, comfort. I no longer had that warm, fuzzy feeling. I don't think Antonio did either. We just existed with very little care and no direction. Things had certainly gone downhill. But a week before that day, something changed. Suddenly, Antonio wanted to be around me all the time. It wasn't exactly like it used to be, but I saw glimpses of the old Antonio flickering through our dysfunction. He smiled at me again. He looked into my eyes. He touched me when he spoke to me. He flirted with me and called me little girl. I felt that old thing trying to come through. Unexpectedly, Antonio told me that we needed to take a break from the businesses. He suggested a trip to Hawaii, and I was all for it. Although we kept up the front for outside purposes, I knew that Antonio and I were on our last leg. And if I had to be honest, I missed him. I saw him every day, but I missed him. I missed us. I was hoping that the trip would bring us a little closer to where we used to be. Hawaii was where we took our first big vacation together. It was the trip that solidified my place in Antonio's value system. It held a special meaning for me, and I felt that it held a special meaning for Antonio as well. I prepared myself for our trip. I arose early and got my hair braided, at Antonio's request, of course. The African women who I had come to know well braided my hair beautifully. Afterwards, I went to the nail salon where I got a French manicure and the best pedicure that I'd had in a while, also at Antonio's request. Antonio was very particular, and while I usually chose things that were contrary to what he would have chosen, I obliged that day. I told him that he could have things his way as a thanks for the vacation. Antonio and I ate lunch together. We went to the same seafood restaurant where we had gone on our first date. Unlike the first time, the restaurant was full and buzzing with the sounds of laughter. Also, unlike the first date, I was skilled in the art of eating lobster. I thought about our first time there and how far we had come since then. It was such a happy day. It was a beautiful spring day, not too hot, not too cold. We ate outside and enjoyed the sunshine. It was hard to imagine that anything bad could happen on a day like that day. But isn't that how I felt the first time Ron took me to the shack? We drove to Antonio's office. While I was reviewing his paperwork, Antonio came in and locked the door. I knew exactly what that meant. We both smiled at the prospect of having quiet office sex. Antonio walked over to my side of the desk. He picked me up and sat me on the desk. Just as he had done on the first day, Antonio undressed me. He looked into my eyes as we had the best sex we'd had that entire year. It was sensual. It was erotic. It was amazing. Antonio and I laughed when we were done, reflecting on how he had to cover my mouth to muffle the moans. It was incredible. Antonio took me to my car and we parted company. There was nothing special about our goodbye. It was a simple peck on the lips and a promise to meet up later. It wasn't special, but it was normal. It was comfortable. It was perfect. That day was reminiscent of old times, back before things were complicated by hurt and betrayal. I went on my way and Antonio went his. I collected some last-minute items and made my way home. In spite of the fact that Antonio and I were set to leave at 8 o'clock the next morning, I still hadn't finished packing. I looked at the clock. It was 7:30 and I promised Antonio that I would be there by 9 o'clock. I knew that I was going to be late. I was notorious for being late, and Antonio hated it. I showered and got dressed. It was 9:42 and I was just leaving to make the drive to Antonio's. He'd be annoyed, but he'd be okay. We were leaving for Paradise the next morning. How could he stay mad with me? I made the drive to Antonio's. I parked in the back just as I did every other time I visited. I retrieved my overnight bag from the front seat, leaving my luggage in the trunk. I knocked on the door. Antonio greeted me with a smile. "You're late, little girl." He cupped my chin and gave me a peck on the lips. "I ordered Chinese," he said. Antonio took my bag with one hand and used the other to escort me into the house. He dropped me off in the living room and took my bag into his bedroom. Antonio returned to the living room and took his place on the couch. "Come here, little girl," he said. I walked over and straddled his body. I asked him if he liked little girls. We both laughed. It was reminiscent of the first time he kissed me in his office. I draped my arms around Antonio's neck and he placed his hands on my butt. We kissed. It was a passionate kiss. He ran his fingers through my braids just like he used to. As crazy as it sounds, everything came right back. The love, the attraction, the butterflies, all of it. I realized why I had fallen for him in the first place. That entire day had shown me why. He was amazing. He was so amazing. Antonio reached over and retrieved his cell phone from the end table. He smiled while entering something. It was the smile that he gave when he was about to do something nice for me. Antonio pressed play and placed his phone back on the table. A song started playing. It was "Where Do Broken Hearts Go" by Whitney Houston. Antonio asked me to stand. I did as he requested. He smiled as he addressed me. "Dance with me, little girl." We danced and kissed. Antonio sang the lyrics to the song. It was the most wonderful moment that I had ever experienced, past or present. He sang, "Where do broken hearts go? Can they find their way home, back to the open arms of a love that's waiting there? And if somebody loves you, won't they always love you? I look in your eyes, and I know that you still care for me. That was the moment when it all started to make sense. Everything that had transpired over the course of that week had been Antonio's attempt to get us back to where we used to be. The words of that song hadn't ever resonated so deeply with me. Antonio wanted to find his way back home, and the fact that we really loved each other guaranteed that we would always love each other. Antonio held me tightly, like he didn't want to let me go, and I didn't want him to let me go. The doorbell rang, and Antonio went to retrieve our food. He passed me an egg roll. I opened my container and already knew that I would find my favorite, General Tso chicken with extra sauce, lo mein with no onions, and extra broccoli. I looked up to smile at Antonio. He was already smiling. I absolutely loved his smile. We talked about an assortment of things over dinner. We laughed. The conversation was easy and effortless, just as it was before. That's why I loved him. That's the Antonio that I had fallen in love with. Antonio looked at the clock before addressing me. "It's after 11 o'clock, little girl. Let's go to bed." I asked him if we were going to bed or if we were going to sleep. Again, we both laughed. He said, "I love you, little girl. I'm never gonna love anybody the way I love you." I told him that I loved him as well. Antonio picked me up and walked me into his bedroom. I loved when he did that. Just then, the doorbell rang. Antonio and I exchanged glances. I could tell that he was genuinely confused about who would be visiting that time of night. Antonio told me to stay in the bedroom. He said that he would get rid of whoever was at the door. I did as he requested. Besides, I wanted to change into my lingerie before he came back into the bedroom. I changed clothes and seductively positioned myself on the bed. I was there for approximately 10 minutes before I started to get impatient. We had a busy morning ahead and hopefully a busy night. I needed Antonio to come to bed. I decided to investigate the cause of Antonio's delay. I grabbed my robe and walked towards the door. I heard voices. It sounded as if Antonio was arguing with someone. I should have stayed in the bedroom. I should have done what I was told. If I had the wits of a normal person, I would have, but my curiosity got the better of me. I often wonder if things would have transpired differently if I hadn't come out of the bedroom. Even more, I've wished a million times that I would have stayed home that night. I've also wondered if I was just meant to be there, like a greater power knew that I would have needed to have those good memories that we created that day. Or maybe it was karma. In either case, I can't take back what happened, as much as I wish I could. All good things come to an end. I tied my robe and walked out of the bedroom. As I got closer to the voices, a sinking feeling came over me. I knew something was wrong. I entered the living room to see two familiar faces. I locked eyes with Antonio first. There was something in his expression that made me feel panicked. He looked sad, maybe even scared. My eyes quickly made their way to the right, where I saw the second familiar face. She was angry and she was crying. She was my karma. She was Sharon. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shenny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in purchasing books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome.